So, hello everyone, and welcome to this CCSE conversation. This is an initiative of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events of the University of the West of Scotland. The centre has developed from a collaborative partnership between UWS and the Renfrewshire Council, and the CCSE provides a space to undertake collaborative research and development work that has local, national, and international relevance. So as part of this conversation, we have today with us Professor James Higham from the University of Otago. He is a professor in sustainable tourism, and he is the co-editor of the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. His research interests address tourism, sustainable development, and environmental change, and the interplay of sport and tourism. He's published over 10 books, I think 13 if I counted right, James. And some of them, very well known in the field, such as sport and tourism, globalization, mobility and identity, sport tourism development, tourism, recreation and climate change, international perspectives, critical issues in tourism, low carbon mobility transitions, and understanding and governing sustainable tourism mobility. And I know James well for my time at Otago, and I'm grateful for allowing me to have this conversation with you, James. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Sandro, and it's great to see you.
James is interesting, and obviously I was doing a bit of research on your background, and your work was when I went to Otago in 2008. Your work was well known for me, like sport tourism. But then I remembered that I saw your PhD thesis, and I think there was something about environment elements on your PhD thesis already. And then I started to look to your books, and one of your first books was looking already to sustainable and sustainability issues. And then there's all this work on sport tourism, and now a lot of your recent work is focusing on mobilities and sustainability and emissions, right?
Yeah, that's right. So my first research in the tourism field was in nature-based areas, wilderness management, wildlife management. My master's and PhD research were in the natural dimensions of tourism. When I finished my PhD, I was really interested in diversifying and broadening my research horizons. And coincidentally and very fortuitously, Tom Hinch from the University of Alberta visited Otago soon after I finished my PhD. That was 1998. He spent a year with us. And he and I spent lots of time that year conversing and discussing and developing a research program in sport and tourism development. And so that's where that thread really emerged from. And it became a major focus of my research for probably most of 10 years through the first decade of this century. But then I continued to explore and the focus on aviation and emissions, climate change and tourism really emerged around the time that you were at Otago, around 2008, 2009. And that's obviously been a major focus of my work since that time.
That's really interesting. And obviously, with the pandemic now, things change completely in terms of tourism and emissions as well. If you want to talk a little bit about the movements of people around the world. So what's your view? I know you've published a little piece at the conversation, and we exchanged emails about that yesterday about travel bubbles. What's your view in terms of the pandemic and the impacts on tourism?
Yeah, the pandemic, has just put us into a set of circumstances that are quite unprecedented and that we couldn't possibly have imagined at the start of the year. Obviously, it's had a crippling effect on tourism globally with lockdown conditions and border closures and unprecedented restrictions on personal mobility. In New Zealand, our international border was closed, and it's never happened before. So obviously, the tourism industry has been brought to its knees. The border closure combined with lockdown meant that tourism ground to an instant halt. And since then, we've been confronted with the challenge of restarting We've come back down through the lockdown levels in New Zealand. So people have been able to move domestically again. And we've faced the challenges of a black start, as they say in some sectors, which basically describes the challenges of restarting from a complete standing start. Incredibly complex for such a complex industry as tourism. It's incredibly challenging to undertake a black start.
James, how's the situation now in New Zealand? Do people still need to stay 2 weeks in a hotel before they can circulate in the country? Is that still the situation?
Yeah, so we went back down from lockdown level 4 down to 3, 2, and 1, which allowed us to move domestically again. At that point, there was 0 community transmission in New Zealand, and there were still flights coming into New Zealand, very limited, but mainly expatriate New Zealanders wanting to come home. Yeah. Obviously, there are huge uncertainties in the global context. We've heard about Kiwis in the UK, for example, who haven't had consideration given to visa extensions. If they can't come home, they are lost in global cyberspace. You know, they've got nowhere to go. So we do have people coming back into the country, and it's the border that has become the main focus of our COVID containment. We do have COVID cases in this country, which has come from the border, people coming back to New Zealand. But as yet, we've contained that, and we still have 0 community transmission. So within the country, we're able to move. We're able to attend events. We're able to go to stadiums. We're able to go skiing and congregate en masse, unlike most other parts of the world. But we still have to keep a very tight security around the border.
Yeah, and that's it. Like obviously, like the number of international tourists is probably minimal because people need to go stay 2 weeks in a hotel or quarantine before they can circulate. Please. So the international tourists are probably very, very limited just now. And then you speak on your conversation piece about the idea of a bubble between regions. And I would like to go a little bit more in detail about that piece because I think a lot of the points that you make are about travel and tourism as that economic force, right? And then how a bubble with Australia, for example, would help the economy to keep moving, but also a reduction in carbon emission because the influx of Australians cause less carbon emission per New Zealand dollar spent, let's say. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the response to COVID is both focused at 2 temporal scales. The first is the immediate recovery. And there's been a huge emphasis in this country on how do we help stricken tourism businesses to survive this crisis. And that has immediately led to conversations around air bridges or travel bubbles. Yeah. And the most obvious one is with Australia because it's our nearest and most important international market. So with lockdown coming off, there's been a resumption of domestic tourism. Domestic tourism is hugely important, and that's helped our tourism businesses to survive. Tourism in this country is worth 40 billion New Zealand dollars a year. 23 billion of that 40 is domestic tourism, right? So that's really important. And we've just had 2 weeks of school holidays in this country. And some destinations, Kaikoura, up 59% total visitor arrivals on last year, entirely domestic tourists. The West Coast, another domestic destination region, up by about the same. So there have been lots of Kiwis traveling within New Zealand. So that's great. But the next challenge is to open an air bridge with Australia. And that will really help us to get the industry powering up again, because Australia brings about 1.5 million visitors a year to New Zealand, and that's worth about $2.5 billion. Yeah. So really, really important. But then, as you've alluded, the next challenge is how we rebuild tourism for a sustainable, resilient, climate-safe 21st century. So we've now got this opportunity to really rethink what the future of tourism might look like for this country, which is a fascinating question and an enormous opportunity to confront some of the issues around carbon emissions, over-tourism, crowding and congestion in some of our regional bottlenecks like Queenstown, social license and social impacts in small communities that have been overwhelmed by tourism in recent years. Yeah. So the other point that I made in the conversation piece was that if we really focus on domestic tourism and our closest market, Australia, and perhaps also the Pacific, we are talking about markets there that are far more sustainable in terms of emissions than our super long haul origin markets like the UK, Germany, and North America.
Yeah. And it's interesting because obviously 2 points there is, one is about the domestic tourism, and we've seen countries like my brother is in Italy, and they got financial support to travel. So they got a voucher of 500 euros to be able to travel around the country, which is is fascinating because that's the way a lot of countries are finding the solution to closed borders, right? And the other thing is about obviously the way we are rethinking and the opportunity, the potential unique opportunity we have to really rethink tourism and rethink our mobilities and rethink our emissions and the emissions that tourism causes that are becoming more and more problematic in terms of climate change. Now, obviously, when you read these things, it's interesting and but also raise questions to me in terms of New Zealand and Australia are developed countries, strong economies. It's fine to have a bubble. What about countries like Brazil or Argentina, or countries that have they're not as developed and they're not as structured as New Zealand? So what about these countries, because they quite rely somehow on some income, from international tourism? And I guess like a lot of countries in the Pacific, like I don't know, Fiji or Cook Islands, you may have seen something about that in how much they rely on international tourism, how that would work in your views with these bubbles.
Yeah, again, really fascinating questions. Your question leads me immediately to think about how things are evolving globally, and it strikes me that there's almost a two-tier system emerging, which is that in some parts of the world we have tourism reopening between countries that have not controlled COVID. I think about the World Tourism Organization encouraging borders to reopen and travelers to try and restore their confidence to move between countries where COVID is not contained, where there is community transmission. That's hugely worrying. The ambition that New Zealand has is to restore tourism only in ways that are not going to threaten our status of no COVID transmission within our community. And the Trans-Tasman bubble, as initially proposed, has had a real setback because the state of Victoria in Australia has not got COVID under control. And the likelihood is that will be a long-term setback to the Trans-Tasman bubble proposal. So the other idea that has been floated in this country is a Pacific bubble, and opening New Zealand to air bridges to our Pacific Island neighbours who do not have any COVID, who are not necessarily threatened by COVID by being linked to New Zealand, and who are highly tourism dependent. Now, obviously, that air bridge, that bubble, would serve more outbound tourism purposes than inbound, although we do receive some visitors from the Pacific Islands. But that would be a gesture of support for the economies of our Pacific neighbours who are so reliant on tourism. Rarotonga, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga have really appealed to the New Zealand government to accelerate plans to open a Pacific bubble. And as long as we can do that safely, I think the Prime Minister is in favour of that.
Yeah. It is interesting, and I think it also raises the issue to me, and I'm doing a work that I'm about to submit to the Scottish Parliament here about how not I'm looking specific to small businesses, right? Rural tourist businesses, but I think you can generalize to countries, which is how much we rely on income from tourism. And suddenly, this tourism became so important for the economy of the countries that anything like what happened with the pandemic, that we probably most of us never thought, just is crashing the economy. And is that not an opportunity now to rethink the way we diversify our economy, to still have the tourism, but not being like, so reliant on the money coming from tourism and international tourism. So, and the piece I'm looking specifically is some of these rural businesses that are looking specifically to rural tourism businesses to have a diversification of their activities and income. So if they stop getting tourists, they can still produce whiskey or produce gin or have their lamps or have other things that they can do, so they can still have some income generation instead of really going bankrupt. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that we're going to hopefully discover with the current extremely sad situation, but that can hopefully make us a better society. And
I think that is exactly the line of discussion that's emerging here. In late December the 18th last year, our Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton, released a report on sustainable tourism in this country, and it highlighted the problems of sustained high growth, high volume, low value, and largely environmentally unsustainable, certainly in terms of climate change, tourism. That was just less than 2 weeks before China reported the novel coronavirus to the World Health Organization. Now we have an opportunity to take that report and ask the critical question, which is, what do we want tourism to look like? What is the tourism that we want to rebuild? What are the aspects of tourism that we like and want to retain? And what are the aspects of tourism that are actually not so useful to us, and we may want to question and not retain in future? And that opens up some fascinating avenues of discussion and some really fascinating and timely research questions.
And one of the points about that is obviously our mobility as an academics, and your recent piece just published on Nature, which is it's awesome to see, because it's not always that we see tourism or travel published on such outlets, where you talk about the decarbonization of traveling and academic conferences. So I'd just like to hear a little bit about your views on that. And again, that's something I've been doing work here with the Glasgow Convention Bureau about academic conferences in Glasgow and the importance of academic conferences in Glasgow, and now the idea of changing the way it's done. So I would like to hear about it.
Yeah, these are really fascinating questions, particularly from a personal point of view, given that Otago University, my institution, as you know, is a long way from everywhere. It's one of the most remote internationally recognized universities in the world, geographically distant from collaborators, sources of students, international conference venues and such like. And over the course of my career, I've become increasingly concerned with the carbon footprint of academic activities, particularly activities that sometimes disappointed me in terms of the benefits of attendance, personal attendance. So occasionally I traveled to conferences earlier in my career that required a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of CO2 for that matter. And I would sometimes return to New Zealand feeling quite disappointed with what had been achieved from those investments, if you like. Of course, academic networking and building one's profile and networking and being well connected internationally is hugely important to our academic endeavors and to our careers. But given the carbon cost of high air travel dependence amongst academics, we do have to rethink how we interact with each other. Some activities are more critical than others in terms of air travel. So, it's very difficult to be an Antarctic scientist without flying to Antarctica. It's very hard to be an archaeologist without traveling to conduct fieldwork, excavations, etc. But conferences are one area where we can decarbonize quite significantly and very quickly. And COVID has taught us this. One of the benefits of COVID, if you like, and I know that there are enormous downsides, but one of the positives to come out of COVID, I think, is that conferences that had been scheduled for March, April, May had to immediately pivot and replan because of lockdown and border closures. Some of those conferences were cancelled, some of them were postponed for a year or more, but many went online, and many innovated with virtual attendance and bringing people together through virtual networks, online platforms. And the responses have been fascinating. There have been conferences that have gone online, for example, that have seen a spike in registrations for virtual attendance. Many of those registrations from countries that historically have not been represented at those conferences, which questions historical inequalities. Much of the feedback of virtual conferences has been really positive about being able to connect with people without flying, without traveling, without leaving home. So the Nature paper was led by colleagues at Oxford, and in that we proposed quite a new model for conferencing that I'm happy to discuss if you want to, if time allows. But we started looking at ways that would allow us to drastically reduce the carbon footprint of our conferencing activities.
Yeah, it's really interesting because actually, in one sense, it's really reducing inequalities because you're allowing people from countries that have, for example, and again talking about Brazil, where the conversion of money, it's really difficult because our money is not worth as much as pounds or euros or so on. So the cost of traveling, financial cost of traveling for academics is really high, and doesn't allow them to attend many conferences, right? But at the same time, you have the problem that a lot of these conferences and face-to-face conferences, it is the opportunity for early career academics or young academics to engage with other more senior academics and benefit from that environment in their career progression, right? So, I remember like a lot of the benefits I had going to conferences was always, lunchtime or coffee breaks where I can, speak to people and know people, and then develop partnerships or other things. So, but again, there is a role in terms of, I think, and on that side in terms of the participant. The other side is the perspective of the whole cities, right? So Glasgow, for example, developed a huge profile in terms of being a whole city for conferences and benefit from bringing those people to the country. We are hosting the European College of Sport Science in 2021, I think, or 2022. And just talking, like our university is one of the organizers of the event, is just talking about having these 3,000-4,000 people in the city and the economic impact of that and how relevant it is for the local businesses. But at the same time, it's always important to think about what is the cost to the environment. And actually, if our most important agenda nowadays is climate change, we should really rethink the way we are. If we assume climate change is not a priority just now, it's fine. But I think pretty sure it is, and it should be. And if it is, then we really need to be serious about how we not cancel all of them, not make all of them online. But I think you propose on the paper a lot of models in terms of how you can host them. You can host as a hub, and how you central them to reduce travel of people and access for people, or make them hybrid, making them you can access, but you also have them online and I think it's also a process of making it democratic. It's not a part of democratization of knowledge and almost like it's an opportunity to allow knowledge to be open access.
Yeah. I think you've touched on several really important points. I totally agree that networking and disseminating knowledge and presenting work to one's peers is hugely important, particularly for early career academics. I recall the first 5 years of my career were greatly assisted by being able to attend conferences. And I'm not suggesting for a minute, I don't think in the paper we suggest that face-to-face interactions through conferences should end. But one thing that we did see with this paper, and as I say, colleagues at Oxford led the analysis that really focused on the carbon footprint of people traveling to international conferences, which found that the vast majority of the carbon footprint was actually generated by a relatively small proportion of delegates who travel extremely long distances to attend, such as me traveling to Glasgow to attend a conference. So what we proposed in the paper was a 3-hub model, where in each of the major continents, if we were to have hubs that could be linked virtually, then people from my hemisphere travel to my hub. I don't come all the way to Glasgow. As much as I'd love to see you, Sandro, I interact with people in my hub, so we still get that face-to-face interaction. And this allows us to overcome extreme long-haul travel on such a recurrent basis while still interacting with our peers. The other thing we propose, of course, is that maybe we don't need our conferences to be once a year. Maybe we don't need them to be annual. Maybe if in even years we host a virtual conference, and in odd years we use the 3-hub model to get together and interact virtually between hubs, then we will have the opportunity to retain the benefits of face-to-face, and maybe technologies that we don't yet have available to us in future will allow even better interactions and networking and socializing virtually. But in the meantime, this model allows us to play with reducing conference emissions by 80 to 90%.
And the other thing is also the different associations looking to the same thing. So you have Leisure Studies Association, you have the Canadian Leisure Studies, you have the ANZELs, all different their own conferences and attracting people. And why not create a hub of these associations that are exploring basically the same topics, and once a year do one conference with hubs around the world and creatively. But that would involve people really pushing to work together, and also seeing conferences not as an opportunity to make money, but to actually share knowledge and produce knowledge. So,
and under this scenario, Glasgow can still host a hub, and people will travel to Glasgow, and the benefits of tourism associated with hosting a hub will still accrue to Glasgow, but the delegates hosted in Glasgow will be from Europe, and I won't fly from New Zealand. In my mind, I have a shift from a conference-based model where we travel every year or multiple times a year to more a sabbatical leave formula where we travel perhaps once every 3 years or 4 years or 5 years for longer periods of time to achieve much more during one travel opportunity, and therefore ramp down our emissions significantly.
Yeah, I remember that when we hosted you for the LSA 2014, that was the case. You were in Europe already on your sabbatical, if I'm not wrong, and you caught a train from Oxford to Glasgow. So
that's right, and that, I think that for me personally is the way we need to be thinking, to be thinking about our carbon footprint. I'd love people to read the paper, because one of the key points in the paper is on the last page of the article, which says these are the associations and the organizations and the institutions and us as individual academics who need to be thinking about reinventing conference activities for a carbon safe future. And I'd really encourage people to be thinking about what we put forward in the paper and the part that they may play in reinventing the future of conference travel.
And just before we finish, obviously, I just wanted to touch a little bit about this idea of knowledge development and how much we are learning and developing with the pandemic and the impacts on tourism. And in your role as an editor of the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, there's been an insane amount of research being published about the pandemic. It's almost difficult to follow and catch up with all that's been published and written. I just wanted you to share a little bit of your views about what's being produced and the speed of things. Just I'm not sure if it's just me, but it just feels the speed of research is just took another level.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to see how the world of academia has changed. We have been hit with a pandemic. Journal editors have been hit by a tsunami of papers that are responding to COVID. The quality of the papers is variable. Some have been pushed through very fast-tracked to submission, and that's evident in those publications. So some are immediate responses. The Journal of Sustainable Tourism has already published papers on the pandemic. The first that we published was by Stefan Gosling, Dan Scott, and Michael Hall, and that has in very short time become the most read journal paper in the history of the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. In fact, it's had close to 70,000 reads in the last few weeks. An immediate response to COVID and an immediate response to the challenges that COVID presents. A really worthwhile paper that people should read. The other thing that we've seen coming through the journal is people pivoting their research. So research that was in train, so to speak, was in progress when COVID hit, and has had to pivot to accommodate the new circumstances, the unprecedented circumstances, and the new challenges that we see. And some of those papers have been really effective in taking work that was in progress and kind of not so much rethinking, but perhaps reinterpreting the findings to the new world that will emerge post-COVID. And I think those papers have adapted well and offer rich insights into the opportunities that COVID will present for a future of sustainable tourism.
Good. So I think I just want to say thank you. I think it's been really insightful, and I know I asked you only for half an hour, considering it's quite late in New Zealand just now, and you need to enjoy your family. So it's been just fascinating to see you, James, and talk to you. And we do hope that the situation gets better with the pandemic, around the world. And I think we all hope to be able to see each other at some point. Probably flying less, not as often, but we do hope that be able to at least engage with the people that we love and the people that we see. Obviously, being way more conscious about the way we travel, the way we move, and the way we do tourism in a more meaningful way and in a more conscious way about our impacts as well. So. So just to conclude, just thank you. And not sure if there's anything that you want to say.
Nothing really, other than to say it's been my absolute pleasure to chat with you again, Sandro. And we're on opposite sides of the world, but for the last 40 minutes or so, it's felt like we've been in the same room together, which brings back wonderful memories of your time at Otago. So thanks for the opportunity to chat, and I look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks, James. Thank you so much.